So, a lot of, I don't know if you found this, but there's a great literature about weaving or braiding. There's guidelines from the UN about, they choose the word integrating um, Indigenous knowledge into scientific knowledge and technical knowledge. And so we choose the word weaving. Sometimes we use braiding, but mostly we use weaving just because it's what the communities we're working with right now, that's their preference. I do like the word weaving or braiding because I think it, versus integrating, because I think integrating implies that there's a dominant knowledge system. I mean, yes, there is a dominant knowledge system as far as how most of the world is operating on the Western colonial model, but what we want to do is bring in that both knowledge ways of knowing are equal and that they deserve to be woven together versus one integrated into the other. So I really like this definition. Um, so I put that there for you. You can read that. And so the local early action plans, there's two parts to this. One is lessons learned that we have found have been very successful. And then they're of just doing the leaps. But the other part of this story is that we find that this is a very tangible, actionable examples of how we're weaving knowledge systems. Because as I said, a lot of people talk about it, but it's not that easy in practice because you have such different systems, and just saying you're going to do it is one thing, but actually doing it is another. So hopefully this will give you some examples of how we're doing that. I'm going to go over what is a local early action plan, key components and some lessons learned, and then more detailed examples from the Kainai, and that's a typo on my part, sorry, it's Piikani First Nation, concluding remarks and discussion. And these two First Nations are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy in Southern Alberta. Okay, so what is a leap? And if you know all of this, please just, sorry if I'm going over stuff you already know. It's a simple plan. It's meant to be not something that's going to tell you how to do culverts or what kind of big infrastructure to change. It's about early actions that the community can take that are relatively inexpensive, so you don't have to wait a long time for that huge grant to come through, or for, in some cases, chief and council to sign off on something. And the idea is that you can get moving on some things quickly. And it includes a set of priority options, the quick wins, so a portfolio of both the threats. So 3 is usually the number that we work with, 3 highest risks, and 3 strategies of dealing with those risks that could be traditional or non-traditional. You will have a list, when you do this, you have a list of a whole bunch of strategies, but what you want to do is pick the 3 most likely that you can get done, like in the next 2 years, for example. But it's part of the larger adaptation planning process, and you've probably seen wheels like this, building awareness, gathering knowledge, the community engagement, and then implementing some of the strategies and the iterative learning, that whole process. So, oops, pause. Laura, there. So during the LEAP process, you're gonna find out, well, what types of potential climate impacts do we even need to adapt to? Some of them you already know because you've been doing this work, and some of them you may not know. But in all likelihood, the biggest threats facing your communities have already emerged. So, but what parts of the community and culture are being impacted and likely to experience the most severe consequences? And there's some workshopping can do in this question that gets people thinking certainly outside of whatever lens they have. So some people have a real economic lens, like climate change is just going to impact our economic gains. Some people are going to look at it from more of a cultural perspective, but what's good is to see all sides of community and culture that are going to be impacted, and who or what adapts. Is it infrastructure that's going to have to adapt? Is it people that are going to have to start thinking about change? And how? What are going to be some good ways to adapt, some measures? So what we've found very successful in our process is that we did pre-LEAP engagement sessions. They were essentially workshops, but we have found that a series of small workshops that they were quite consistent in the delivery, but they were with less than 15, like anywhere from 5 people to 15 was the max that we had. Worked really well, the small groups, and some of the groupings were mixed, youth and elders and some of the leaders in the community, and some of them were very specific, so they might have just been emergency services and health, and some sessions we did just with the elders. And there's certainly merit in just doing some sessions with elders, for sure. It all depends on how the community is. It was really guided by the communities we worked with. They told us the groupings that they wanted and what they thought were best. And it was interesting with the Kainai First Nation, because originally we were going to do it based on the societies. And then we decided to mix, not to do it based on societies, but to mix it. And sometimes it was just, there was a couple of sessions that it was just who was available and came. I think those were more of the mixed ones, but they all worked very well. We would start with a very basic overview of climate change. So about 20 to 30 minutes of very basic, like what is adaptation? What is mitigation? What are the differences? Where do they overlap? What are carbon sinks? So just this words that maybe for some people they know, some people know a lot about, and some people knew nothing about. And we just assumed that people came to the table not knowing, so that we all were able to talk about things together. And that actually helped a lot, because I think there was some people, when they didn't know some of these terms, they were able to ask more questions and understand it in their own context. And I'm not sure how it is for you, but like there's not even a word in Blackfoot for climate change. So we would often have a translator with us, so that some of the concepts that we're sharing could be translated into a Blackfoot concept about change. A really dynamic discussion. So we would do that, and then we spent the rest of the time, we had about 3 questions that we asked. And instead of getting like, sometimes you get like a clipboard and questions and you ask them and write them. We didn't do it like that. It was all a dialogue. So we would ask questions, and very much about what were the observations they'd been seeing over periods of time, and what are their concerns, and then what are maybe some solutions. So we spent anywhere from an hour to 3 hours, depending on the size of the group and who was in the group, just talking. And then we did record this systematically so that it could help feed the actual LEAP later. Okay, so components included our past, which is an interesting exercise, because we found the first one we did was quite involved and complicated, and because of COVID now, this next version of it is going to look a little bit different, but it's still gathering information, people thinking about major events that have happened in the past, and then looking at actual projections that have been gathered, not projections, but the actual timelines, the historical trends that have happened during that period that scientists produce, and comparing the two. So when there was years of, so for a community member, they may say, I remember years and years where we couldn't grow crops, or where our animals were dying, or they have this experience of a period of time in their life. And then when we look at the chart, you can see, oh yeah, like science didn't experience it that way. They experienced it in a different way, but the records are showing that you had these years of drought, or that you had unprecedented rainfall, and lo and behold, you had a flood. So we have this discussion about experiential observations, and also what it can be collected. And then that leads into how the projections that scientists are making now can help your planning, your adaptation planning. And then present and future concerns. So what we found really helpful here is that all after doing the dialogues, so we did quite a few of them, quite a few sessions, and we had all this information about what community members were feeling and seeing, and we gathered that, and we found the common themes. And then we went into the deeper planning. So then groups were able to say, yeah, for sure, like we see these are all risks. And in some cases, they added some risks. So it was actually really interesting, because one community, they didn't worry as much about flooding. The individual members, they were worried about other things. But when we started to work with tribal council, they were really worried about flooding, because they had different information, and also because the costs of flooding. So for them, flooding was much more important on the scale. So it's really important to have that balance of different community members and different perspectives. So then the final part was our needs and being better prepared. So we did some identifying of the top 3 risks: early, actionable, and the traditional and non-traditional. And we would go through, like fire, for example, was a top risk. What would be only traditional ways, if that's all we were going to do is just come about it from our cultural perspective, what is that going to be? And then made a big list. And then non-traditional would be things like Fire Smart, or other tools that are out there now. And how can we bring these 2 things together? Where is their overlap? And this is where some of the really interesting weaving happened, actually. And that was all community led. They found ways that if there were things that Fire Smart had recommended, for example, they wanted to do it in a Blackfoot way versus just, like a handbook that maybe Fire Smart would hand them. And this is an example of a leap sheet. So hopefully you can see that okay. So you'd have like, what is the adaptation idea? And here's an example. For one community, they felt like they needed a lot more technical information about floods. So what they wanted to do is a best practices in flood report. They wanted to get that conducted. And just general, what are some best practices in floods in a geographic region like theirs? And they actually identified that as one of the first things they could do. They had a little bit of funding that they were able to get it paid for and engage a student. So that was something achievable. So you can see, like, you identify 3, what is the plan, and then you take this sheet and you work with the community on the deeper planning. Obviously, you have to have a program plan after that, or project plan. Okay, just bear with me. I'm having a technical difficulty there. Kainai First Nation. So this is actually overlooking into the St. Mary River, and we're on what used to be a cattle ranch and is now being repurposed for bringing back bison. A beautiful area. They're the largest by land mass of a First Nation in Canada, and we spent about 3 years in the community, where it was a slow process, but it was as it needed to be. It really was. And about 100 community members, so very mixed group of community members. But it was part of, so the LEAP, and both LEAP examples are part of a bigger initiative, a multi-year initiative, so about adaptation and capacity building. So there are other components of this was the art of climate change with youth and elders, which was phenomenally successful in the community. These are the 5 youth, and they did this I Am the Change. With this whole exhibition, all of their outputs are actually at a it's called the Cave and Basin, which is a Parks Canada National Historic Site, and it has a public exhibition area, which is unfortunately closed right now, but will be open later in the summer, it sounds like. And anyway, they learned about what we were doing, and they put it up on exhibition. They recreated the work so it could be outside on these big boards, and it's just beautiful. But what this part of the program was some of these youth, they went through the LEAP as well, but then they also worked with a Blackfoot artist of their choice, and they worked with, we had some grant funding for this to support it, and they learned about climate change science, and then they interviewed elders. Then they decided what kind of art output they wanted to do, and they pulled it all together. They created a piece of artwork. You can see one of Jade's piece is in the background. Like I said, I could show you more of this if you're interested, but then they had community engagement around this, so they were able to share their stories about what they learned, how they feel, what they want to do going forward. And then the other component was an in-community traditional database. I'm sure you're experiencing similar, that elders are getting older and older, and knowledge, they're worried, is being lost. So they didn't have a database to collect the information. What they wanted to do is have a plant database that has the traditional reference of what they call the plant in Blackfoot, also the scientific name of the plant, scientific information about where that plant grows best, what conditions does it need to thrive in, but then local information about where they've seen the plant, where they aren't seeing it anymore, and also what it's used for. And it took us a long time to get to a place where we were able to help them, but we had a botanist work on this, and the agreement was the botanist didn't need to know what the plant was used for, where it was. The botanist helped them with the name of the plant, the scientific name, the ideal conditions it needs to grow in, and then created a database that is fairly easy to use. So the community and multiple community members are getting trained on it. It's an access database, and they've got multiple people who can use it and then go out with the elders and collect this information for themselves. So we never see the database or have any access to it beyond creating the framework and helping along. And so it worked out actually beautifully. And nobody was worried about sensitive information being shared with an external organization. And then we helped with a new community climate change role. So we got a little bit of money for them to, similar to your roles, be able to have somebody in-house and mentor and learn and continue to keep some of this initiative going. This is an example. This is Kanzi Fox. She's the lead really at the Kainai First Nation that I work with. And this is an example of her documenting some of the traditional strategies. It was really interesting because almost every one of the risks identified having an elders relational network, so that any proposed action that was significant for the community, adaptation action, would be vetted, I guess, or talked about with the elders relational network. Is this the direction we should be going, or how could we be doing this differently? How can we honor the work that we're doing? And this is not the best example, but it certainly is an example. You've probably been told to clean up your deadfall from any trees or old branches and things, part of the fire smarting. There's an area in this landscape called the timber limit where there's a lot of deadfall, but it's on traditional land. And so there's this push to clean up this deadfall, but people haven't been comfortable just taking it and removing it. So what they're talking about is, well, what could we do with this deadfall, and how could we honor this process in a different way? Could we, there's songs and stories about fire and trees that have been blown down that they can sing and incorporate into, well, they're actually picking it up, and then use some of that for their building, their sweats or other ceremonies. So that's how we're like, there's a very tangible thing. Yeah, we need to get this deadfall up because it's a fire hazard, but no, we don't just need to take it and move it and truck it out of the reserve. We need to do some other things with it. And then the reintroduction of bison as an adaptation strategy was one of the, that is actually a really good example of being both cultural and an ecological key. It's a key ecological and cultural keystone species. So it ends up being a strategy that both aligns very well to culture and also to the ecology of the landscape. So Piikani First Nation, we are just starting this journey with them. Well, we're a year into it. Also part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and they were actually quite inspired by the work that was happening at the Blood Tribes. So they wanted to do it, but they wanted to do it the Piikani way. They didn't want to just do it like it wasn't going to work. Piikani is a smaller community, and there's different, just slightly different structures. So what they said is, well, we don't want all these adults working on it. We actually want to create a youth cohort, and we want them to lead the planning and gathering of information. And so that's what we're doing, which is actually really doable in context of COVID, thank goodness. I mean, it's much more preferable to do it everybody in person, but we're going to be able to do this, thank goodness. So this also is part of a multi-year initiative. And the other components of this one that we find is quite interesting is that there's a school greenhouse that's happening in tandem. And again, youth cohort involved in this. How do we use information about renewable energy, and can we weave that into the greenhouse concept, and how is this tied to food and water security? And what's really interesting about this one is that this is kind of our new way of doing things, because before we used to spend a lot of time on knowledge sharing and education, then doing some planning, and then implementing. And we're flipping that model on its head because there's not enough time to do all that. We have to do it, but in different ways. So we want to look for those early actions like a school greenhouse, where we can also do the education, also engage the community, and do the longer term planning all at once. Okay, so in the context, in the COVID context. So we're starting to do as you are all doing, we're doing today workshops online with youth, and we will help with some of the training online as well, but they will do the interviews. Hopefully they can do in person in the community. It really depends on, it's all about the elder or the individual that they're interviewing, if they want to wear masks and do that safely, it's their call. Or if they want to do it on the phone, they can. So we're going to continue. And then we also have an Indigenous community liaison, Elliot Fox, who lives in that area. So he's able to help by going. We will not go to the communities right now. If invited in later when it's safe and there's measures, of course we will. But I'm sure you guys are doing similar stuff, carrying on, but in different ways. So those are some concluding remarks. LEAPs are relevant tools. We're finding they're helping, really a good tool in helping bridge knowledge gaps, and could help advance climate change adaptation goals. And we find it very important because Indigenous knowledge offers ways of thinking about life as web, interconnected, holistic, and that science doesn't automatically offer those ways of thinking. And so by doing this, yes, it's complex, but it's also really important. So if there's the time and the energy and the commitment between partners, I think that the type of knowledge that comes, the co-created knowledge that comes out of this is useful to everybody being able to live and think about the world differently. And then just, I added this sort of later. For us, it's flood, fire, and drought here. I mean, high winds and major storms also certainly are a concern. But we know planning is important and these long adaptation plans are important, but we don't want to have something, a plan that just sits on a shelf. So one of the big lessons we learned is, and we did, like, we did not do a big elaborate adaptation plan. The Blackfoot, you probably have seen some really elaborate adaptation plans, and the Blackfeet in the US did a beautiful plan. It's like thick, it's got everything in there, but it's not, nobody's doing anything with it because it's complicated and because there's other priorities. And this is not what we want to see happen. We want to see these early actions started, and to do that, it really does mean it has to be something that is relevant to your community, and every community is different, and is going to build, is something that you can build on in a relatively quick way, because these things are coming. And that's my last slide, just to say thank you. And I gave a quote from, if you've seen Braiding Sweetgrass, it's a really, really nice book by Robin Wall Kimmer. I think she's out from your area, not from here. And then a little bit of information about us that you already know. So that's the presentation.